In a world where silence often masks injustice and quiet compliance maintains the status quo, what happens when one voice, calm yet unyielding, shatters that silence? Today's story unfolds not in headlines or viral tweets, but in the quiet corridors of power, where a seasoned businessman named Dwayne Johnson refused to let his dignity be quietly erased. What began as a simple boarding pass dispute at an airport gate spiraled into a reckoning that exposed the quiet rot lurking beneath. Polished professionalism. Stay with us to witness a masterclass in resilience, a story that will make you rethink the power of silent determination and leave you questioning how many such injustices go unchecked every day. Whether you've faced moments where you were expected to stay silent or simply believe in standing up for what's right, this story will captivate you. Hit that subscribe button, click the bell icon, and join us as we unravel the layers of power, silence, and the unshakable resolve that changed everything. The early morning light shimmered through the towering glass panels of Los Angeles International Airport, bathing the terminal in an almost ethereal glow. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that masks the frenzied pulse of travelers, the orchestrated dance of boarding calls, and the scraping of luggage wheels across polished floors. Amid the crowd stood Dwayne Johnson, 53 years old, his silhouette exuding quiet strength and authority. His tailored charcoal suit caught the light just so, contrasting sharply against the blur of hurried passengers. In one hand, he held a rich, mahogany suitcase. In the other, a sense of composure that many in the bustling terminal lacked. Dwayne had weathered countless airports before. He was no stranger to the subtle power plays that coursed beneath the surface of such spaces, the silent calculations of who belonged and who didn't. But this morning felt different. There was something in the air, a charged undercurrent that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. His steps, though measured, seemed to echo louder than usual against the sleek tiles as he approached the check-in counter at Gate 24. Behind the counter, Chloe Patterson stood poised, her name tag gleaming with corporate polish. As Dwayne approached, her eyes flitted over him, assessing, judging, calculating. The moment he spoke, his voice smooth, deep, and tinged with the accent of his Jamaican-American heritage, her lips curled into a thin smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind of smile that whispered condescension while feigning professionalism. "That's quite the accent you have there," she said, her tone light, but laced with an edge that was sharper than it seemed. Without waiting for his response, she tapped briskly on her keyboard, her fingers moving with exaggerated concern. "Looks like there's been a change to your seat. You've been reassigned to economy, seat 44E. A hush seemed to fall around them, as though the terminal itself recognized the weight of her words. Dwayne's breath caught not in surprise, but in realization. He'd booked seat 2A, a first-class seat earned not just through loyalty programs, but through decades of hard work and success. "I booked 2A, he said quietly, his voice calm and even. Chloe's smile tightened, her eyes glinting with practiced indifference. "Sometimes the system corrects itself," she replied smoothly. "Maybe there was an error in the booking. It happens more often than you'd think." Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some craned their necks to observe, while others sighed in impatience, silently willing Dwayne to simply accept his fate and move along. He felt his pulse slow, his grip tightening subtly on the handle of his suitcase. This wasn't just a clerical error. It wasn't about the seat. It was about something far more insidious, the unspoken decision that had been made the moment. He stepped forward, the subtle but unmistakable calculation of his worth based not on loyalty points or travel history, but on the color of his skin and the way his words rolled off his tongue. As Chloe turned her attention to the next passenger, a man in cargo shorts and a crumpled boarding pass, whose approach was met with cheerful efficiency, Dwayne stood, silent, his posture straightening, his resolve hardening. In that moment he understood something deeply unsettling. This wasn't a loud rejection, not the kind that drew attention. It was a quiet erasure, delivered with a smile and sealed with a click of a keyboard. His voice remained steady, but his mind was already moving far beyond the gate. He wasn't just a passenger today. He was the storm they hadn't seen coming. Dwayne Johnson remained rooted at the gate counter, his posture commanding but calm. The faint drone of terminal announcements blended with the muted shuffle of impatient passengers behind him. Chloe Patterson, still wielding her brittle smile, acted as though the conversation was over, as though her casual dismissal of Dwayne's first-class booking was a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic slip. But Dwayne wasn't done. His voice, steady and firm, cut through the thin air. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Chloe's eyes narrowed, her smile fading just slightly as she tapped her earpiece with exaggerated patience. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone syrupy, but strained. She radioed for assistance with a kind of deliberate slowness that made it clear she expected the request to be a dead end. The minutes dragged on, stretching into an awkward silence punctuated by the low murmurs of other travelers shifting restlessly in line. The atmosphere thickened with an almost tangible discomfort. Behind the scenes, a young staff member named Lucas glanced nervously toward Chloe. His posture was tense, his lips pressed together, as though weighing the risk of stepping forward. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the counter, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want you in first class," he murmured, glancing at Dwayne with a flicker of guilt. "It's better to keep you in economy, less visible." His words hung in the air like smoke, wrapping around Dwayne's resolve, but failing to shake his composure. Dwayne processed Lucas's quiet confession without a flicker of visible emotion. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, his silence sharper than any spoken protest. The line behind him shifted again, growing more agitated, but he didn't move. He wasn't here to make a scene. Not yet. The power wasn't in raising his voice or demanding attention. It was in gathering evidence, in collecting every piece of whispered condescension, every ripple of quiet injustice that would later become undeniable proof. His phone vibrated softly. In his pocket, a discreet message illuminated the screen. "Ready." It was from his executive assistant, a pre-arranged signal indicating that the necessary preparations were complete. Legal teams were aligned, communications were on standby. Financial departments were poised. Dwayne's slight nod acknowledged the message, his lips tightening into a thin line of determination. Chloe, sensing that her earlier confidence was faltering, attempted to recover. She redirected her attention to the next passenger, a man with a disheveled appearance whose boarding pass was met with a friendly, efficient smile. The contrast was stark, but no one said a word. Travelers averted their gazes, their faces betraying the discomfort of silent complicity. Some muttered under their breath about delays, eager for the scene to resolve itself. But Dwayne stood his ground, his presence a silent testament to resilience, a quiet storm waiting to gather strength. He understood now that this wasn't a simple mistake or an isolated slight. It was systemic, a well-oiled machine of subtle biases and quiet erasures. Every delayed response, every evasive glance, every chuckle behind the counter was part of a broader pattern. Dwayne had seen this before, not just in airports, but in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the halls of power where smiles masked exclusion. But today, they had underestimated him. They thought he would accept the silent dismissal, the unspoken downgrading. They thought he would fade into the background. Instead, Dwayne allowed the silence to stretch, every second adding weight to the moment. The surrounding passengers may have felt the inconvenience, but they were also witnessing something. they couldn't quite name, a resistance too quiet to provoke, too composed to ignore. Dwayne's calm presence sent an unspoken message. This wasn't over. The reckoning wouldn't come with shouting or demands. It would come later, in ways none of them could yet imagine. And as he stood there, waiting patiently for a supervisor, who might never come, Dwayne wasn't just a man with a suitcase. He was a man with a plan, a storm brewing quietly, methodically, and with the precision of someone who knew the true rules of the game. As Dwayne Johnson stood motionless at Gate 24, the terminal hummed around him with the mechanical buzz of daily travel. Behind the counter, Chloe Patterson continued her tasks with a practiced efficiency, her smile now stretched thin beneath the mounting tension. But Dwayne wasn't watching her anymore. His eyes tracked every movement, every shift in the staff's body language. He noticed the furtive glances exchanged behind the counter, the way staff whispered low and shuffled nervously. It was in these silent gestures that the true nature of the system revealed itself, complicit, seamless, and coldly indifferent. Further down the terminal, Grace, a young flight attendant, moved past Dwayne. Her eyes flickered briefly in his direction before darting away. Her pace quickened as though the mere proximity to the unfolding tension made her uncomfortable. Dwayne caught the subtle tremor in her hands as she adjusted the lapel of her uniform, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Dwayne noticed. He saw the silent struggle, the hesitation between standing up and walking away, between courage and compliance. Grace's decision was written all over her body language. She wasn't ready to confront the system, not yet. Meanwhile, Lucas, the junior staff member who had whispered the truth, returned to the counter. His posture was hunched, his expression tight with unease. His lips moved in quick, clipped sentences, speaking to Chloe in hushed tones. Though Dwayne couldn't hear their words, he read the story in their gestures. Lucas was uncomfortable, reluctant, caught between following orders and recognizing the injustice that played out before them. Chloe's response was a subtle shake of her head, her voice soft but laced with finality. "Just let it go, Lucas. It's not worth it," she said, her saccharine tone covering the barbs of dismissal. The air around Dwayne thickened. He felt the weight of the system pressing down, not with overt force, but with the quiet complicity of everyone involved. Passengers in line stole glances his way, then quickly turned away, choosing the comfort of silence over the discomfort of engagement. A woman seated across the aisle, her designer bag tucked neatly at her feet, locked eyes with Dwayne for a fleeting moment before looking down at her phone. It wasn't malice that made her avert her gaze. It was fear, the fear of being entangled in a confrontation that might disrupt her carefully curated world. Even the security officers, stationed near the terminal's entrance, watched impassively. Their hands rested lightly on their belts, their expressions unreadable. They weren't called into action because nothing here was overt. There were no raised voices, no explicit violations of protocol. The discrimination was seamless, wrapped in smiles and systems that left no paper trail. It was a script they had seen play out countless times before, and they weren't going to disrupt the flow of airport routine over something so subtle. In the quiet hum of the terminal, Dwayne's phone vibrated again. A discreet message flashed on the screen from his executive assistant back at the Denver office. Ready. The preparations were advancing. Legal teams were standing by. Corporate partnerships were being re-evaluated. Every stone of this system's foundation was about to be tested. But Dwayne remained still, calm, his face betraying nothing. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He was here to watch, to record, to let the system expose itself through its own actions. Grace passed by once more, her steps hesitant, her breath quickening. For a moment it seemed she might stop, that she might say something, acknowledge the injustice unfolding in plain sight. But the pull of silence was stronger. She lowered her head, quickened her steps, and disappeared down the terminal. Dwayne followed her briefly with his gaze before turning his attention back to Chloe, who now focused on a man in a sharp business suit. The man's boarding pass was crumpled, yet Chloe's smile was warm and accommodating as she reassigned his seat to a premium location with a few swift keystrokes. Dwayne noted every detail: the casual override, the preferential treatment, the quiet efficiency of exclusion. He filed it away, each observation a brick in the wall he was building against them. The gate buzzed with final boarding announcements, voices rising in manufactured cheer. Passengers gathered their belongings, eager to escape the thickening tension. Yet Dwayne remained seated, his posture unyielding, his presence an immovable anchor in the rising tide of indifference. As the last passengers disappeared down the jet bridge and the staff prepared to close the gate, Dwayne stood slowly, his coat draped neatly over his arm, his suitcase perfectly positioned at his side. He approached the counter one final time. Chloe looked up, her smile brittle, her voice prepared to deliver one last practiced line. But Dwayne spoke first, his voice low, steady and rich with the promise of reckoning. "I hope you're ready," he said softly, "because this story doesn't end at gate 24. With that, he turned and walked away, his silhouette a quiet storm moving beyond the confines of the terminal that had tried and failed to erase him. As Dwayne Johnson disappeared from the gate area, the atmosphere within the terminal shifted imperceptibly. It was the kind of shift not marked by loud voices or public outrage, but by a subtle ripple of realization. Chloe Patterson, though maintaining her composed exterior, felt an unfamiliar weight settle on her shoulders. Her practiced smile faltered slightly as she continued her duties, but her mind replayed the encounter with Dwayne in fragmented echoes, his steady voice, his unflinching gaze, the quiet promise of consequence woven into his parting words. Each click of her keyboard now seemed more brittle, each smile more forced. Grace, the young flight attendant, stood near the far edge of the terminal, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the lapel of her uniform. The weight of her silence pressed down harder than she had expected. She had witnessed it all, the smirks, the whispered warnings, the seamless erasure, and yet she had done nothing. The realization gnawed at her. This wasn't just a one-off encounter, it was a reflection of the system she had chosen to blend into for the sake of survival. She felt the sting of complicity, the sharp pang of knowing she could have spoken, but didn't. Her eyes followed Dwayne's fading silhouette, a silent apology lingering on her lips that would never be spoken. Lucas, too, wasn't immune to the quiet unraveling. He returned to his workstation, his hands trembling as they skimmed through flight manifests and booking records. His mind wasn't on the tasks at hand. It was caught in an endless loop of the morning's events. Dwayne's composed resilience haunted him, a stark contrast to his own indecision and inaction. Lucas had always trusted the system, believed in the rules and protocols, but today those rules had shown their cracks. His complicity felt like a stone pressing against his chest, heavy and unyielding. In the operations office, Dennis Marks, the wiry shift supervisor, monitored the situation with growing unease. The incident hadn't been formally reported, but the whispers had already begun. Staff radios buzzed with murmured exchanges. Security personnel exchanged glances. The digital logs displayed seat reassignments and override codes, but no one had flagged it as an issue. At least, not yet. But Dennis knew. He sensed the slow unraveling of control, the subtle tightening of a noose they had collectively fashioned through complacency. What had once seemed like an ordinary day was now teetering on the brink of something far more consequential. Elsewhere in the terminal, Dwayne sat quietly in the executive lounge, his phone in hand. Messages flickered across the screen from his network of advisors and partners, Legal experts, logistical teams, communications strategists. Each message was concise, calculated, a silent move on a chessboard no one else could see. His face remained impassive, his breathing steady. The disruptions were beginning. Vendor contracts were being quietly revoked. Premium reservations were frozen. Behind the scenes, the foundation of the system that had tried to erase him was starting to tremble. Back at the gate, the surface calm was cracking. Terminal screens glitched momentarily. Passenger manifests flickered inconsistently. Chloe's fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she tried to correct seat assignments that had inexplicably reverted to their original states. Lucas overheard snippets of panicked conversations from supervisors. System errors were blamed on glitches, on oversight, but those at the center of the unraveling sensed something deeper. Chloe's smile faded completely as she realized the control she had once wielded with such ease was slipping away. Grace lingered near the jet bridge, her eyes scanning the scene, hoping for someone to step forward, to call out what had happened. But no one did. The silence thickened around her, suffocating in its weight. And then, as she watched Chloe's increasingly frantic gestures and Lucas's pale, guilt-ridden face, Grace understood something profound. This wasn't just about one man or one moment. It was about a culture, a system built on quiet complicity. The true danger wasn't in the loud moments of injustice, it was in the silent agreements that let them pass unchecked. Meanwhile, Dennis Marks paced the operations office, his phone pressed to his ear. Calls to regional managers went unanswered, messages piled up in inboxes. The usual order was fracturing, but no one dared say it aloud. The system wasn't just experiencing a glitch, it was crumbling under the weight of a reckoning it hadn't anticipated. And at the center of it all, Dwayne Johnson remained composed, methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to let the silence speak louder than any shout. By mid-afternoon, the terminal at Denver International Airport was no longer humming with its usual rhythm. The polished corridors and glass walls, once symbols of efficiency and control, now seemed to tremble under the weight of silent disruption. The systems that had long operated with smooth precision, check-ins, boarding assignments, vendor communications, were now glitching, faltering, revealing cracks that had always existed but were now impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, emails were queuing up in executive inboxes, urgent messages were being whispered over radio channels, and beneath the calm surface, a wave of uncertainty was growing. Dwayne Johnson wasn't at the center of the commotion. He had already shifted his focus, leaving the terminal, but not the game. In his Denver office, tucked high above the city skyline, he sat quietly with his legal team, reviewing real-time updates as they poured in from various corners of the operation. His strategy wasn't loud, wasn't public. There were no press releases, no dramatic social media posts. Instead, Dwayne's approach was a masterclass in quiet power. Contracts were being reevaluated, vendor relationships frozen, reservations cancelled without fanfare. The system that had dared to sideline him was now struggling to maintain its balance, and Dwayne was orchestrating every move with calm, measured precision. Back at the airport, Chloe Patterson was summoned to a hastily convened meeting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runways. She entered with her notebook clutched to her chest, her hands trembling slightly. Dennis Marks, the shift supervisor, sat across from her, his face pale, his posture stiff. Flanking him were two men in dark suits from the airline's corporate compliance division, their expressions unreadable. One of them spoke, his voice clipped but controlled. "We need to understand what happened. This reassignment, the system overrides, the intervention at the gate. Was there an error?" Chloe hesitated, her voice faltering as she recounted the morning's events. She spoke of Dwayne's approach, of the subtle smirks exchanged, the quiet decisions made without formal documentation. As the words left her mouth, They twisted into something fragile, laced with an emerging regret she hadn't expected to feel. "We thought it was standard," she murmured, "but we didn't think about what it meant." In the terminal, Grace lingered near the service corridor, her thoughts heavy with guilt. She watched families shuffle through the gates, children clutching stuffed animals, business travelers tapping impatiently at their phones. Amidst this mundane routine, the weight of her own silence pressed down harder than ever. She remembered Dwayne's composed yet unyielding presence, his quiet dignity in the face of systematic exclusion. The memory haunted her, and though she hadn't spoken then, the need to speak now burned within her. Elsewhere, Lucas hovered over a console, his heart pounding as he traced the escalating system failures. Error messages blinked on his screen. Vendor. Codes returning errors, boarding queues misaligned, priority systems failing their usual checks. He realized what was happening, though he hadn't been prepared for it. This wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. Dwayne's hand was evident in every failure, every quiet disruption. Lucas's hands trembled as he understood just how easily one underestimated individual could shift the entire balance of an institution that had always seemed untouchable. As the day wore on, the executive wing of the airport became a hive of whispered anxiety. Compliance officers gathered behind closed doors, their conversations terse and urgent. Rumors circulated about Dwayne Johnson, about his connections, his influence in elite travel and logistics networks, his company's reputation for swift, decisive action. The realization dawned slowly, chillingly. He wasn't just a disgruntled passenger. He was a cornerstone client whose quiet decisions were now causing cascading failures in their operations. The old playbook, the one that relied on subtle discrimination and assumed silence, was unraveling before their eyes. But amidst this chaos, Grace found a spark of courage. She requested an impromptu meeting with her supervisor, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to report something," she said. She outlined what she had witnessed at the gate, the whispers, the dismissals, the silent compliance that had allowed it all to happen. It wasn't a comprehensive report. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a crack in the wall of silence that had protected the system for too long. Back in the quiet of his Denver office, Dwayne watched the unfolding tremors without a flicker of visible triumph. His focus wasn't on retaliation. It was on recalibration, on shifting the very foundations of an industry that had grown comfortable in its quiet exclusions. He wasn't seeking an apology. He was setting a precedent, one that would reverberate far beyond the glass walls of any terminal. The tremors rippling through the airport were no longer subtle. By late afternoon, the polished calm of the terminal gave way to a tense hum of whispered concerns and malfunctioning systems. Lucas sat at his station, his fingers trembling over the keyboard as error messages cascaded across his screen. Boarding passes misaligned, priority codes failing, vendor transactions stalling mid-process. Each failure was a quiet echo of the storm Dwayne Johnson had set into motion. Lucas's face, pale under the fluorescent lights, betrayed the realization dawning on him. This wasn't a fluke. It was a deliberate, systematic disruption, orchestrated not through loud confrontation, but with precise, silent strikes that rippled outward from a single, composed man who had refused to be erased. Meanwhile, Chloe Patterson, who had once wielded her authority with a brittle smile, now found herself cornered by consequences she hadn't foreseen. After her hurried debriefing with Dennis Marks and the compliance officers, she sat alone in the staff break room, her reflection in the scratched mirror staring back at her with unsettling clarity. For the first time, she let the weight of her actions settle heavily on her chest. Her fingers hovered over her phone before she began drafting an email. Not to her supervisor, not to HR, but directly to Dwayne Johnson. Her words were raw, stripped of corporate polish. "I saw what we did and I didn't stop it. I didn't speak because it was easier to stay silent. I'm sorry." Grace, the young flight attendant who had hesitated at every step, now found herself at a crossroads. The image of Dwayne's steady, unyielding presence haunted her thoughts as she moved through the terminal, her steps faltering with the weight of regret. She had seen the injustice. She had recognized the quiet compliance that allowed it to flourish. Now, she realized that her silence was a choice she no longer wanted to make. Steeling herself, she approached her supervisor and requested a formal meeting. "I need to report something," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the nervous pounding in her chest. It wasn't a comprehensive report, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of silence that had protected complicity for too long. In the operations center, Dennis Marks struggled to contain the spiraling chaos. His phone buzzed incessantly with unanswered calls, messages piled up in inboxes, vendor codes flagged as errors, reservations disappeared from the system, and internal review notices clogged the workflow. He paced the room, his mind racing as he realized the full extent of the disruption. This wasn't just a system glitch. This was a deliberate, methodical dismantling of their infrastructure, orchestrated by Dwayne with precision and calm that left no trace of hysteria, only undeniable consequence. Back at his Denver office, Dwayne remained a quiet conductor of the unfolding crisis. His focus wasn't on retribution, it was on recalibration. Legal teams were executing carefully calculated withdrawals from partnerships that had once been cornerstones of the industry. Financial departments were closing accounts, canceling contracts, freezing operations. Each action was taken not for spectacle, but for impact. This wasn't about public apologies or empty gestures. It was about systemic change, accountability, and a clear message. The days of quiet exclusion were over. In the terminal, Grace felt the weight of her decision begin to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. She wasn't seeking recognition or praise, only the chance to correct the silence that had once defined her. Lucas, too, found his own way to break the cycle. Though he didn't draft a heartfelt email, he submitted a formal report to corporate detailing the system overrides, procedural lapses, and silent approvals that had enabled the discrimination. His report was dry, factual, but it was his version of replacing silence with accountability. Through it all, Dwayne watched with unshaken composure. His actions weren't about vengeance, they were about reclaiming dignity, setting a new standard not just for himself, but for everyone watching. His quiet dismantling of the system wasn't an end, it was a beginning, a signal that silence, once a tool of oppression, could be wielded as a force for transformative change. As night descended over Denver, the city lights shimmered against the deep blue sky, casting reflections on the sleek surface of Dwayne Johnson's car as it glided smoothly through the quiet streets. Behind him, the skyline receded into the distance, a sharp contrast to the quiet storm he had set into motion just hours before. Dwayne sat in silence, his gaze steady on the road ahead, but his mind was tracing every moment of the day's events. It hadn't been about confrontation. It hadn't been about making a scene. It had been about truth, exposing it, wielding it with precision, and letting it reshape the system from the inside out. At his Denver office, the flurry of incoming emails and urgent notifications had slowed to a near halt. His legal teams had filed the necessary withdrawals. Financial departments had closed out accounts. Strategic disruptions he had orchestrated earlier were cascading through corporate channels, causing a quiet but irreversible shift. But for Dwayne, these were just formalities. His mind was already moving past the immediate fallout, envisioning what would come next. He wasn't interested in statements of regret or public gestures that masked inaction. He was determined to create something deeper, structural change, rooted in integrity, impossible to dismiss or ignore. That evening, Dwayne composed a message, not for the press, not for public consumption, but a private communication to his board of directors, his core leadership team, and key partners who had stood by his side through challenges and victories alike. His words were clear, deliberate, and unyielding. Our responsibility is to build systems where dignity is the foundation, not a privilege, where silence is not a strategy, but action is, where every decision reflects the values we claim to uphold. Effective immediately, all future partnerships will be re-evaluated against this standard. Any that fall short will be terminated. No exceptions. The weight of those words was not just policy, it was a declaration of purpose, a shift not only in how his organization would operate, but in what it stood for. This wasn't just about punishing those who had failed. It was about ensuring that such failures wouldn't be possible in the future. Dwayne wasn't rebuilding the old system. He was laying the groundwork for a new one that couldn't be undone by bias disguised as bureaucracy or prejudice masked by professionalism. In the days that followed, Dwayne convened a quiet summit at a retreat center tucked into the mountains. Outside Boulder, there were no press cameras, no grand speeches. Instead, he brought together trusted advisors, community leaders, and select partners who had demonstrated a true commitment to justice and equity. Around a solid oak table, they shared stories, some of failure, some of resilience, and began drafting not just policies, but a new vision. As the evening deepened, Dwayne's voice broke the quiet, calm, yet resolute. The systems we build must be strong enough to withstand bias, but flexible enough to correct it. They must be transparent, accountable, and built with empathy at their core. We're not here to patch the old, we're here to create the new. A hushed stillness followed his words, a shared recognition of the depth of the challenge and the collective resolve it would take to meet it. For Dwayne, this wasn't about retribution or headlines. It was about redefining resilience, showing that quiet strength and decisive action could dismantle systems of injustice more effectively than noise ever could. As he looked around at the faces lit by the glow of the firelight, he felt not victory, but purpose. This was the beginning, not of a story about what had been taken from him, but of what they would build together. This wasn't just a story about a man and a boarding pass. It was a mirror held up to systems that thrive on quiet compliance and whispered dismissals. Dwayne Johnson's calm, calculated stand against an entrenched culture of exclusion wasn't a spectacle. It was a testament to the quiet, relentless power of integrity. If his story moved you, if it made you reflect on the silent injustices we so often ignore, then don't just watch, act. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts and experiences. And if you believe in amplifying voices that disrupt complacency and inspire change, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Together, let's create a community that listens, reflects, and takes action. Because silence may be comfortable, but courage changes everything.